Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Eleanor. You may have noticed this is an unusually long video. It's because I'm, for this week anyway, trialing a new way of discussing the books I read during the week. This video is made up of 4 shorter segments, and I filmed them at different times, as the week progressed, because I wanted to record my initial reaction to certain books I was reading, and then how that may have changed or developed through the week. So what I'm going to do, because I realize that you might be interested in what I say about one topic more than another, I will try to be as precise as I can with the timestamps below. The 4 sections follow along chronologically, but you can access each one separately and pretty much know what I'm talking about. So I'll do that. As a word of introduction, I will begin the first episode talking about 2 poetry books that I just bought. And then I will talk about a history book, a nonfiction book called The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt. And I go back and forth between that and the poetry, talking a bit about Lucretius and the nature of things. And I also have a habit of generally in this video discussing what it's like to read poetry, how I struggled reading these books, and different methods. So I hope you enjoy it and find your way through it, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, bye. I bought 2 books. The first is Sylvia Legris' The Principle of Rapid Peering. This is a book that came out in 2024. I'm not new to Sylvia Legris. She's Canadian. She's written several books. A few of them have won awards. I did try to read her previously, and it's I would say she's an acquired taste, and I couldn't resist giving it another go. This one, I think, caught my attention more maybe than the others, just because when I opened it, it seemed to speak to me. Now, why I'm saying that is because Sylvia Legris does something. She works with specialized vocabularies of different areas of science. As far as I know, natural science, biology. I think she has a book which takes most of its vocabulary from medieval texts about the human body. But this specific one, The Principle of Rapid Peering, is about her going through the natural elements around where she lives in Saskatoon. And it happened to be during the time of the pandemic, but it's not a pandemic book. It is a book about her observations and the theme of active observation. And even the little blurb in the book calls it a spray of poems that together form a kind of almanac or naturalist's notebook in verse. Now, I've always felt that when you open one of her books, you really have to submit to the power of the vocabulary, of the words, and of the sounds. And when I did a little bit more research, there aren't many reviews of this particular book on the internet, but I did come up with a word which I had not noticed before, which I didn't know of. And the word is melopeic, and it's an adjective that means words are given a musical quality that goes beyond their normal meaning. Now, often people will give lip service to words in poems, and poems generally, as being like music. So often when I haven't been able to understand logically, rationally, to explain a poem to myself, even if not to others. If I cannot do that, I often will come across someone who, in trying to help me, will say, read it as if it's music. And I'm still not 100% convinced about that anyone can really do that, because we are language people. And sure, you can do it with music, but the minute you bring language in, the minute you're using words, the boundaries are unclear and things can get muddy and muddled. But with this book, I felt that perhaps I can get into it. I'll give you an example. She has a series of poems in the second half of the book. I should say I haven't read this book yet. I've just kind of picked it up and looked around it, through it. Occasionally, The Field of Possibilities is the title of a series of her poems, and each poem starts, occasionally the Field of Possibilities. And the Field of Possibilities is something that, from my experience, is what poets refer to when they're talking about their own craft, their ars poetica. They're talking about life in general, of course, but how you portray it through language. It goes back to a few classic poems that have both the field and the word possibility in them. For example, occasionally the Field of Possibilities is a co-evolved canopy of wing scale and leaf, a broadband acoustic cloak, deflecting echo and foe, wavelengths of powder and light, a cloud of stacked platelets, a thin film percussion, hair-penciled and interlinear, sparkling archaic sun moths, a micro-lepidopterous register. Yes, it is very pleasing to me to simply hear the words, the sound of them. But the pleasure is also from knowing what the words mean, what they refer to, the possibilities in the words. I like it. I find it very exciting, actually. So I'm thrilled about this, but it's a lonely experience. It's a lonely experience to read what was that word again? A melopic book. I think you need people to come together and celebrate it. She also has her own drawings, a few of them, not many, her own sketches in here, which is quite fun. This is called the Lesser Grapevine Looper Liftoff. So that's one book I'm looking forward to reading. And I think what I'll do is, this is the kind of book I'll probably have on my night table, and I might read a couple as I go to sleep. The other one is a small vintage classic. It's called The Ink Dark Moon, and it's got the works of two poets? I'm not actually sure, frankly. Yes. Two Japanese poets, Ono no Komachi and Izumi Shikibu. They were writing more than 1,000 years ago, as far as I can tell. And of course, I only just bought it, so this is the book. It is rather small, so you can see this is already this is a typical size of, no, this is actually a bit narrower than the typical size of a poetry book, but this one is a little bit more squat, it's a little pudgier. Actually, they seem to go quite well together, which I didn't even think about when I got them. I just hadn't seen that Vintage Classics even did this. Apparently, it's the Vintage Classics Love Poetry series. Okay. See, this edition, the artwork for this edition was created by Japanese artist Nomoko. See, I love when they mention specifically the artist, and it's so well thought out. I really love that. So it originated from a time in Japanese history when aristocratic women, I'm just reading, of the Heian court were free to conduct love affairs, to marry, and to follow their desires. Education and refinement was so highly valued that the courtly manner of expressing oneself was with a poem of just 5 lines. As a foreword by Nikita Gill. Now, it was translated, it was translated by Jane Hirschfield and Mariko Artani. Jane Hirschfield is a big name poet, as far as I know, in the US, who is on my list of people to read. So that's, again, wonderful. Now, but that's not really why I bought this. I bought this because they are, well, obviously, they're very short 5-line poems, but they seem so simple. For example, this is page 52. So this is this one. Why haven't I thought of it before? This body, remembering yours, is the keepsake you left. I mean, that's Instagram poetry. And it shows me, see, and immediately I thought, again, it's good to realize the power of Instagram poetry. We may look at it and roll our eyes, but maybe we are the ones who should be laughed off the stage. There is a moment in most people's lives where they discover love and they're in its thrall, and then they lose love and gain love and lose love and gain love. And perhaps this kind of form and the simplicity, and I say that as a positive, and not as a criticism, the simplicity, the clarity of these short bursts of love thoughts, maybe we need to pay them more attention. In fact, I'm convinced we do. And I also think that for my jaded, bitter, cynical, and often resentful heart, and I'm not talking about my personal life, I mean generally I'm mistrustful of declarations of love. I think once you've lived more than 2 or 3 decades, you realize how complex the human heart is, and how complicated, wonderfully complicated, and heartbreakingly complicated all human relationships are. I think I need some of this in my life. Yeah. You ask my thoughts through the long night? I spent it listening to the heavy rain beating against the windows. I very much like that. Yeah, this is going on my night table as well. Okay, so those are my two new books. It's been a while. It's been a while since I bought something really new and different, and I think it's time to mix it up. Okay, I will come back later with some more ideas, with some more details of what I'm going through. Okay. Hi, so it's a couple of days later, and I thought first I will give you my continuing impressions of these 2 books that I mentioned a couple of days ago. A change in view. Now, I should say what I find with poetry generally is that I will change my views, my thoughts from day to day, even from year to year, much more than a book of prose, generally speaking. So Sylvia Legris, The Principle of Rapid Peering. When I started to read it more yesterday and a bit today, I found myself in a strange predicament where I felt very restless and annoyed by the poems. So I think this is expected. This is expected because this is what I found with her previous books of poems that I sort of dipped in and out of. They are poems that are, playing with the language that we use for nature. And part of that play, I think, is to make the reader sometimes uncomfortable because it's not what we're used to. And following up on that, I wanted to mention that I also read in the notes a bit more about how Legris wrote these poems. And she's using a lot of phrases from from other people's books, mostly non-poetic books. She takes quite a few of the words and phrases from Joseph Grinnell's books, and now she does mention that he was at the turn of the century an American field biologist and zoologist. So around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it's actually from his book that she got the phrase that I liked so much, which was occasionally the field of possibilities. And it's actually his book that's called The Principle of Rapid Peering, in birds. And I really like that there's a bit of collaging happening in the poems. And I think a lot of the poets that I love very much do that. And it's a way of bringing in, it would be you'd have to work in a very specialized field to go back to Joseph Grinnell's books about birds in the late 19th century. And it's a shame for that language, that fascinating, gorgeous, and intriguing, somewhat puzzling language that was used at that time in describing natural aspects of the world. It's a shame for that to go to waste. And it's only poets who will bring that into the present. And I think that is the first thing that attracted me to this book, and still does. I think Lucy Brock-Broido does that a lot as well. But it can be, well, frankly, distressing to read this sort of work, because it does show you how, through the generations, obviously, we've changed the way we talk about nature. And that really means that the way we relate to nature has changed. And it's distressing, not because, I'm not going to talk about climate change here, not for that reason, although, it could be. But it's distressing to me because, well, why is it distressing for you, Eleanor? Why should you worry about phrases being so unusual from a few hundred years ago? I know why. It's comforting to think of nature in a way that's a type of trope, a type of cliche. A community, a generation thinks of nature in a certain way. It's comforting to describe birds in the usual way. And when they're described in a way that is not as easy to understand, I think a little trapdoor opens up in our world of language, and it becomes somewhat, there's a foreboding tone, I feel, in The Principle of Rapid Peering by Legris, a foreboding, darker tone that points to the way, no matter how much we try as people to capture nature via language, so no matter how much we comfortingly call a horse and a daisy, we're really pointing to parts of nature that are huge and mysterious, and we really know so little about them. And reading poems that Sylvia Legris writes makes you feel that. It's a different kind of it's a different kind of poetry that'll make you feel differently from the other kind of poetry. Now, I did look up eco-poetics because I couldn't help it. It's something that I was thinking about. And I realized, and I'm not sure if I knew that before, I don't think I quite understood that nature poetry is different from eco-poetics. And I'll link below the page in the Poetry Foundation's website that talks about eco-poetics. And they quote, I believe, Forrest Gander, who's a great American poet. And he writes that eco-poets attempt to offer insights both thematically and formally into the complex interrelationships between nature and culture, language and perception. And that, I believe, is what's happening with Legris. It is fascinating, but it's not an easy read, and it's obviously, well, no poetry is for everybody, so, but it might be for you. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's for me. It did make me very restless, and I don't need to look for things to make me restless. But then, really, if you go past the very mundane world of language, you're going to be restless. It's something that happens. It's troubling to realize how little we know about the world. Now, going back to the Ink Dark Moon, boy, well, I was delighted to find out that it wasn't Crazy Eleanor saying that this felt like Instagram poetry, because so the history of this edition of the poems of these two Japanese poets who were both women, both Japanese, both writing more than 1,000 years ago. This book first came out with the same translations by Jane Hirschfield and Mariko Rotani. It came out first in 1986. 37 years later, it came out, so that's 2023, so 2 years ago, approximately a year and a half ago, it came out again. But this time with a foreword by Nikita Gill. Now, when I first spoke about, 2 days ago, when I first spoke about this book, I then went and read the foreword, and I read the foreword and I saw, at one point in the foreword, Nikita Gill writes, "The boldness here is reflective of a more modern poetry, a poetry I have seen performed on stages and on social media." And I felt, sometimes you question yourself. Well, I do, because what would I know? So this foreword made me feel a bit better about saying that this reminds me of Instagram poetry. But then I looked up Nikita Gill. And who is Nikita Gill? She's an Irish Indian poet, also playwright, writer, illustrator. And according to the internet, she is one of the most followed poets on Instagram. And I looked her up on Instagram, and indeed she is. So it's really interesting. Vintage Classics decided to bring out this book again, 37 years after it was first published, and asked an Instagram poet to write the foreword. How fascinating, how absolutely fascinating. Now, I have gone back to read. Now, I should mention, I know last time I mentioned this, the 5 lines. They are tankas. Tanka is an ancient Japanese form. It is a 5-line form, and in the original Japanese, obviously this is translated into English, in the original Japanese, they follow very strict syllable counts as well, per line, as far as I can remember. Now, it looks to me like Jane Hirschfield, from what she says, decided that together with Mariko Rotani, they decided to not count the syllables, but keep to the 5 lines. And there is an additional note to the poems at the back And they offer the romaji, which is the transliteration of the original Japanese, which is, interesting to someone like me who doesn't know Japanese at all. But to see that it is, it's available here, so you can sort of, understand what the poem might have sounded like in the original. It's rather fascinating. I will say that as I've read a few more of the tankas, I find that their delicacy and their meticulous, often, not always, but often their meticulous eye on certain details of weather or objects elevates it into a different type of poetry from Instagram, or maybe I just haven't read enough Instagram poetry. That being said, I think I could probably put any one of these ancient tankas up online and people would all think it was an Instagram poet from 2024. So there's that. Now, I haven't really spent much time on these, although I did, a little bit of more reading, a little bit of more research. I've been going down a completely different pathway. And I think what I'll do is, because it's so different from my mindset at the moment, I'm going to pause, get my notes and books together, and I'll come back with that in this same video, because I'd like to put down my thoughts before they fly away. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, hi, I'm back, having gotten my notes together in my books, and this will be short and sweet because it's an introduction to a major adventure I've gone on. So, how have I found myself reading a book called The Swerve, How the Renaissance Began by Stephen Greenblatt? This is not a typical Eleanor book. I'm not that interested in history. I'll put that out there. I'll admit to that. I'd never heard of Stephen Greenblatt before. His book, The Swerve, won the Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction in 2012. I had no idea. And he's a great scholar. So how did I come to find this book? And I am now about a third of the way through and loving it. I'm actually reading it like as if it's a thriller of some sort. Okay, so this is how I got there. As you know, I've been reading and trying to wrap my head around several poems by Jean Valentine. This is no news. Part of that project that I've taken up out of pure pleasure has been the reading of, and I've talked about this already, so you're probably rolling your eyes with boredom. It's been the book that's called Jean Valentine, This World Company, which has a series of essays in it about Jean Valentine's work. Now, I've also talked ad nauseum, and I apologize, but this is the way I got to to that book. Brenda Hillman has an essay, and it's called The Gift of the Double Swerve, Jean Valentine's Endings. Now, in that essay, Hillman mentions Lucretius. Lucretius probably wrote a lot in his lifetime, but only one of his works survived, and that is On the Nature of Things. Now, what Hillman writes, and I'll just quote a short paragraph, is this. Lucretius writes that the swerve is what keeps atoms from bumping into each other. Just as they are about to make a mistake and strike other atoms, the atoms deliberately swerve. Lucretius is not speaking metaphorically. This is a proposal for how matter keeps itself going, just as imagination does. then she quotes, I'll spare you the quote from Lucretius, but then she goes on to say, "This is rather like the end of Jean Valentine's poems, a bit of sound that is allergic to logic. A bit of sound that is allergic to logic finds a swerve of avoidance that makes reality possible." This intrigued me to such an extent that I went and found Lucretius's book on the nature of things, and it is a book. It is indeed a book-length poem, which I didn't quite realize the last time I spoke about it. And I looked around a little bit on the internet and I saw it being described as a strange poem by several people. And so this is right up my alley, a strange poem by Lucretius, who lived around the time of 99 to 55 BCE. I'm there for it. But it's a long book, it's a long poem, and I'm not, as I said, I'm not a history buff. I don't really know what I'm doing. I wanted to kind of feel my way. So I did a bit of research and realized that what we're talking about here with the swerving of the atoms is that Lucretius is describing in his poetry the ideas of another philosopher called Epicurus. But that is neither here nor there, although it helped me sort of get context. Suddenly, I noticed online that there's a book called The Swerve by a scholar called Stephen Greenblatt, and it's connected to Lucretius and his book. And that's how I found it. Now, The Swerve by Greenblatt is the story, and it is nonfiction, and he is a historian. He's also a Shakespeare. He's primarily a Shakespeare scholar, but in any case, this is a historical account of the adventures of one Poggio Bracciolini. Yes, I do enjoy pronouncing it. I know no Italian. An excellent name for an excellent man who lived between 1380 and 1459, and he searched, he went on the hunt for books. He didn't want just books, he wanted old books. He wanted to discover old manuscripts that were hidden away in monasteries for years and years and forgotten about. He is every booktuber's dream. Everyone who's ever walked into any bookstore, any secondhand bookstore, who's watched any videos about the collecting of books or historical books is very much in Poggio Bracciolini's team. So he at one point comes across Lucretius's one text. Now, I've only read about a third of the book, and I'm treating it as a thriller, and so I haven't looked up more details about the history of it because I want to enjoy it via Greenblatt's incredibly vivid and exciting writing. But suffice to say that it's thanks to Bracciolini that we now have Lucretius's, that I, for example, have On the Nature of Things in my library, and you can go and buy it. I believe as a Penguin Classic. I mean, it's a huge text that always seemed to me to awkwardly sit on my shelf and say, hey, I don't know, I'm really boring, but I am sort of a poem, and check me out, it's philosophy, and maybe you'll like it. And now it's one of the most exciting books on my shelf. So I think I will leave it at that, just as an example of how one thing can lead to another. And that is when I'm at my happiest. So I will come back in a day or two, having hopefully, probably, I'm sure, finished that book. And I do have some other poetry to talk about, and I'm sure things will come up. So I'll see you then. Okay. Okay, hello again. This is probably going to be the last episode in this week because it's the end of the week. So I have finished The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt, and I highly recommend it. What a fantastic story. Look, as I said, I'm not a history buff. I do follow quite a few booktubers who are, and I'm in awe of them, and I learn a lot from them. So tip of the hat to you if you're watching, and please forgive me as I come to this from a place of ignorance. But in any case, the historical account that is available to me, is so accessible to me in The Swerve, has fascinated me, and has indeed proven to be very helpful in giving me the context I need before I start reading Lucretius's On the Nature of Things. Now, Greenblatt has, within his book, he gives a brief list, which he says is by no means exhaustive, of the elements that constituted the Lucretian challenge. It was a challenge to the world he was living in the 1400s, as it was actually, originally when, in the 1st century BC, when Lucretius actually wrote this, and even further into the past, because Lucretius was basing a lot of his poem on the philosophy of Epicurus, if I'm not mistaken. So to whet your appetite as to what this poem by Lucretius from the 1st century BCE has as its subject matter, I thought I'd list to you what Greenblatt lists in his book. So first of all, everything is made of invisible particles, and it's astonishing to think that this was a discovery so long ago. Well, I don't know if it was a discovery, but it was a philosophy, it was a belief. The elementary particles of matter, the seeds of the things, are eternal. The elementary particles are infinite in number, but limited in shape and size. All particles are in motion in an infinite void. The universe has no creator or designer. Everything comes into being as a result of a swerve, even poetry. I mean, of course he wrote, it had to be written as a poem, of course, I think. I mean, that's just, continuing on. The swerve is the source of free will. You see how these are dangerous ideas, both for a time when paganism was the norm and a time when Christianity was the norm in the 1400s, when Poggio Bracciolini rediscovered this manuscript. Nature ceaselessly experiments. I mean, this is astonishing. The universe was not created for or about humans. Humans are not unique. Sorry, I've lost my place. The soul dies. I repeat, the soul dies. I mean, people were burnt at the stake for copying, distributing, and believing in the nature of things. There is no afterlife. Death is nothing to us. Now, all organized religions are superstitious delusions. Religions are invariably cruel. There are no angels, demons, or ghosts. The highest goal of human life is the enhancement of pleasure and the reduction of pain. The greatest obstacle to pleasure is not pain, it is delusion. Now, understanding the nature of things generates deep wonder. And that brings me back to poetry again, because understanding the nature of things is fundamentally what all true poets really are about. And poetry readers, understanding the true nature of things. Now, the fact that there is no afterlife and death means nothing to us, that was the most important thing for Stephen Greenblatt when he first discovered and read Lucretius' On the Nature of Things. He was a young university student. This is from his foreword. And he had lived, up to that point in his life, he had lived under the shadow of his mother's extreme anxiety about death. And it affected him as it would. He was very close to his mother. And discovering that it is possible to live your life with the idea that death means nothing was extremely, well, it was life-changing for little Stephen Greenblatt. And in a sense, it was, life-changing for the world, really, because, and that's one of the many things that makes Lucretius's work so important, and also means that this book, The Swerve, about the discovery of it by Bracciolini in the 1400s, is so fascinating. And there's a lot of history about books before the printing press, about Bracciolini's incredibly neat handwriting that got him some great work, because that's when people had to read things that were legible. The ideas of libraries and how libraries were in such danger of really being destroyed. And it's interesting to read even for that. Greenblatt talks about bookworms. It really was a problem. Bookworms were really a problem. Also fire, war, censoring by religious leaders. Things just, certain manuscripts, who knows what existed that we will never know because of that. But in any case, also the history of libraries, the idea that you would gather manuscripts in your home and then share them with your friends or with even the general public, the idea that the general public have a right to share those books, it's something that we take for granted now. Also, the way you put the books in order, just the idea of alphabetical order is something that someone had to come up with. So yes, so I highly recommend that. I'm just checking to see if I've forgotten anything. Yes, one more thing. So reading Greenblatt's The Swerve also comes after reading, and also at the same time as reading Jean Valentine. With poetry, you're always going back, and so as I'm reading these two books, and as I'm reading The Swerve, I'm also reading Jean Valentine's poetry when I feel like it, and it suddenly made me realize, in the context of The Swerve and what Greenblatt's talking about, that Jean Valentine's poems talk a lot about the afterlife, the mystery of an afterlife. And a lot of poems do that. And people will say that all poems are about death. And I never really understood that. And I'm beginning to understand what that means. If you're trying to understand the meaning of things, the meaning of life, then that necessarily means that you're trying to find the meaning of death. And that brings me back to this book, because having reread these poems, well, first having read it from cover to cover, and then read the notes, and then reread several poems, I realized that 1,000 years ago, and when these two Japanese poets were writing, they write a lot about the mysteries of death, the mystery of, someone disappearing from your life, whether they disappear because they want to, because they don't love you, or you don't love them, or they die. You love them, but they die. And so that brought me back to the Ink Dark Moon. And I wanted to add a few things to that, because having read it a bit more, my view of it has changed as well, as it always does. So I would say that going back to the idea of mystery, there is a certain, the way I'm looking at my notes, because what I wrote at a certain time when I was reading was, these poems show an absolute certainty about uncertainty. It's a kind of clarity of image pointing to mystery. So the images they portray through their delicate, exact wording points to a mystery. So you have this delicacy, and then you have the heft and the mess of passion, of requited love, unrequited love, and disappearance and death. And so there's something that I find incredibly attractive about that. And it is something that is not available, as far as I can see, in any Instagram poetry, although leave me a comment if you think it is. There's a subtlety in these works, and I've come to appreciate them also because I read more carefully the notes that are added, mostly from Jane Hirschfield, I believe. And the notes give you context, and they're very good. They give you historical context and linguistic context. So historically speaking, how was poetry used by these women? Sorry for the noise if you heard that. How was poetry used at the time by these women in the royal court? And the idea that when you had a relationship with someone, even from the get-go, it involved sending notes to each other, and it involved sending short poems to each other. And of course, not everyone can do that. So there's, you can tell a lot by someone, how they use their language. And of course, I thought about, the way dating nowadays often will start through texting. And, some people are better at language than others, and it shows in their texts as well. But for what that's worth, going back to this idea of the context, there's also a linguistic context. And of course, the translation of ancient, Japanese poetry, you're never going to get the original. You're getting an interpretation. But it is important to try to understand how language was used. And Hirschfield does explain a couple of very interesting aspects of language at that time, and I suppose still in modern Japanese, I'm not sure. The use of pillow words and pivot words. So pillow words are words that are usually connected to, it's usually, I suppose, if I understand correctly, an adjective that's connected to a noun, sort of like the Homer phrase wine dark sea. So I think wine dark would be considered a pillow word. And so there's that, but there's also pivot words that mean two different things, and anyone who reading them would immediately know that. And those two different things don't necessarily seem connected, to me anyway, reading English 2025. So, for example, the reference to seaweed, mirumi. Seaweed is also eyes of seeing. So if you have a poem that mentions seaweed, it also refers to the way the eyes see and the way a lover might see you or you see them. So, and that was a favorite pivot word of Komachi. So this is, if you love language and you're really interested in different ways it was used historically and in different languages, this is, it's just enough. The notes are not lengthy and too esoteric. It's exciting. There's also a reference and additions to many of the poems, and Hirschfeld calls them prose headnotes. I believe they were prose headnotes that originally were written by the two poets for their poems. So, for example, you can see here, there's an introduction. It's like a little introduction. It's an explanation. On a night of bright moonlight, the prince came only to talk by my gatepost. And then there's the poem. If it rained now, perhaps the sky-crossing, gate-passing moon could be kept from leaving. So I think that's a wonderful prose headnote is something that I wish would be used by contemporary poets in English that I come across, because it gives a little bit of context without taking away from the poem. Well, not necessarily taking away. Anyway, so I like that. One last thing I wanted to bring up because I can't resist. On page 83 of the book, there's 4 short tankas that are sort of a series under the title Things I Want Decided. It's so contemporary and so wonderful. Things I want decided. First, which shouldn't exist in this world? The one who forgets or the one who is forgotten? Which is better to love, one who has died or not to see each other when you are alive? What do you prefer? Pick one. Which is better, the distant lover you long for or the one you see daily without desire? Ah, indeed. Which is the least unreliable among fickle things? The swift rapids, a flowing river, or this human world? And that is a mic drop of an ending. I love that so much. So I think I have given you by now a really, really good idea of whether you would be interested in the Ink Dark Moon. Now, going back to Sylvia Legris, The Principle of Rapid Peering, I've got a little bit more to say about that as well. I'm 100% happy that I bought it, and I think I will be returning to it for sure. It is unusual. It does take quite a bit of getting used to, and I needed to, at first, trick myself into reading more of this book because I really wanted to. So how did I trick myself? So first of all, I started reading it just jumping around, one poem here, one poem there. I actually wrote down my methods of reading. That's what I'm like checking. So first of all, I jumped around. Then I thought, no, I'm going to go in order. That didn't work either. I was very restless. So then I thought I'll read backwards. Often, when I can't get into a book of poetry, I will read the poems backwards. So I'll start with the last poem. And that works sometimes because it's sort of, I don't know why, but it sometimes piques my interest. Then there's different no worries. Then there's something that I think is very important. The time of day or night that you read the poetry book, and the space in which you read makes a big difference. And that's something I think that you can't really say about prose as much. It makes a huge difference. If you have a quote-unquote difficult, strange book of poetry, but you really want to get into it, it intrigues you but also repels you. I often find that if I read it just as I'm falling asleep or just when I've woken up, I get into it, I enjoy it. And it's sort of almost as if the key to the poems is in my subconscious, in that the parts of my brain that are not so adamant about everything being logical and having an explanation. So I did that. Also, when I say where you read something, I think that reading it in silence by yourself is interesting. it's very different from reading it with some background music. Let's say you listen to some, I don't know, some background soft jazz or something. That's also different. Now, reading it in public, if you're on the bus or train, or if you're, on your commute, or at a cafe, it's going to be a completely different experience, completely different. And apart from that, if you know that you're going to be talking about it as I do, so if you're reading a poetry book with the anticipation that you would like to discuss it online, or in a workshop, or with a friend, you read it differently as well. And again, sometimes I talk about why I'm interested in recording a video here for BookTube. And again, the idea, the challenge, I accept it. I accept the challenge that this poetry is not going to be only for me, but is going to be something that I want to communicate about to someone else. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm forcing myself to love something, but I am, in a way, forcing myself to engage deeply in something, because I don't want to talk about something on a surface level to someone else. Because I feel like it's not fair. I want to give it a fair go. And that also means that I do change my mind a lot and I jump around a lot, because at different times of my life, or different time, whatever my mood is or wherever I am, I might change my mind. I mean, most interestingly, in my few videos back, in my year in review, there was only like 6 months, I changed my mind radically about the Rachel Cusker book, Parade. And at the time, I just published it because it is what it is. What I feel, I have to be honest with myself, and I also have to be transparent, I feel, about my reactions to books with whoever's watching this. And I will say that since then, I've gone back and realized that I felt radically different 6 months prior. And I still agree with Eleanor from 6 months prior. I still agree with with what I said in the review. And I don't think that's a problem, because there are many different aspects of ourselves that go into reacting to a text. And I think if it doesn't make sense, if we both adore a book for certain aspects and detest a book for other aspects, and sometimes those aspects are the same, that is as it should be. I don't think there is I think it's like falling in love. I mean, you're going to, once you have a solid love foundation, you are well aware that you love someone and can't stand them at different times of the day in different spaces. Now, that doesn't that doesn't negate the fact that doesn't negate the fact that you're annoyed and hate something for a time. It doesn't mean that the love is gone. And apart from that, the fact that I was honest about my extreme annoyance with Rachel Cusk's Parade and my doubting of all the work I did on it, I think that also opened my comments to truly interesting discussions. Go and have a look at very short discussions, but very interesting, between a few of the viewers about what they see in a text. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't sort of brought it to that. So where even was I? Yeah. Okay, so I was talking about the principle of rapid peering and how I read it. Now, I recommend you buy this book. I recommend you buy this book as an ebook. I did not. I wish I had. I'm almost tempted. In fact, I am tempted to buy it also as an ebook, and I'll tell you why. Every second word is a word you won't know. I mean, unless you a very unusual person who's read botanical phrases and descriptions, historical as well as contemporary, you will need to look up these words. You can choose not to, which I did because I'm not going to look up every second word. But if it's on an ebook, you can easily just highlight it and the meaning comes up. It's very handy. Now, I'm going to go back to something else that I always talk about. How much research are you going to do into a book? Now, okay, well, I didn't want to do any research into this. I wanted to, but then after a few days, there I was in front of my laptop Googling, and I'll give a description, I'll give an explanation or a description of like something that happens. So for example, there's a poem in this book called Smell Giveaway. It's towards the end. Page 25. Smell Giveaway, threes on long stalks. So I read it at first, and I liked it, and I could generally understand what was generally happening, being pointed to. But, I don't know half the words. Am I going to look them up or not? So I thought, with this, I'm going to. Okay. So, Gallium triflorum is the name for what a lot of people know as the fragrant bedstraw. And yes, it has 3 fruity structures that come out on each sort of prong. The Gallium sphinx caterpillar is the caterpillar that is known as the bedstraw. Well, once it becomes a moth, it becomes the bedstraw hawk moth, again connected to that same plant, the bedstraw. A swale is a marshy depression between ridges. Then in the third stanza, you do have bedstraw being repeated twice. Now, I didn't know that was referring to Gallium triflorum, so all very well for the poet to put it there, but it didn't mean anything to me until I looked it up. And there you have the bedstraw hawk moth, okay, which I found in Google. But I wouldn't have been able to make a connection if not for Google. A bull-batting nighthawk. Well, a bullbat is a name given to the nighthawk. It is a hawk that is active at night, and it's fabulous to see, just as it was fabulous to see a picture of the fragrant bedstraw and what that looks like. It's also interesting to see what the nighthawk looks like. Why shouldn't you? And a loggerhead is, as I thought, is a disproportionately large head. This is in the last stanza now. A grebe is an aquatic diving bird, and a shrike is a passerine. I'm not sure if it's passerine or passerine. I'm presuming it's passerine bird, and I had to look up passerine, which means it's a perching bird that usually also sings. Hence the pipit, pipit, pipit at the end. I mean, I needed to Google everything to get the most out of this poem. I don't know. I haven't done research as to whether Sylvia Legris expects people to look it up, if she doesn't think it's necessary. Whether it matters or not, I'm not sure. I guess it's a personal thing what you want to do, which brings me to something that I believe C.D. Wright said in a book that I keep going back to, this one. C.D. Wright at one point, I couldn't find it, but I had it in my notes, that she says, poetry is not for tourists. It isn't really. You have to commit. You have to live there. You have to live in the world of poetry. You'll get a lot out of it. Don't be the tourist who kind of wanders around and takes a few photos and then goes home, live there for a while, get an Airbnb and live there for a week or two and pretend that you live there. Pretend that you live in the world of poetry. That's what I am trying to do anyway. Okay, so that's about it. I am looking forward. Now, will I go immediately now and read Lucretius's On the Nature of Things? I'm not sure. I feel like I need an absolute change first, but that will be something to decide in the next week. So if you made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. It makes a world of difference. I think I really have some of the most wonderful viewers. When you show yourselves briefly in my comments, it's astonishing. I'm so pleased you're here. And don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye.